Okay, thank you for joining me again. Well, today we're going to make a transition from Masechet Sukkah to Masechet Yuma. We just have a very quick revision of what we did last year. Feels like that. Last week, at the end of our Shir, which brought to a close Masechet Sukkah, and then we'll go on to Yuma. We'll leave a line, maybe we might be able to make some sort of siyum sufficiently seal Masechet Sukkah. So I was thinking maybe one of the Sudat Shlishits that we have on a regularly weekly basis at Shul would be an opportunity to take advantage of one of those to actually formally close Masechet Sukkah. But just before we do, let me just revise what we learned in last week's shir. It was an interesting historical and storytelling shir. It dealt with the last part of the Mishnah, the last Mishnah in Masechet Sukkah, which tells the story of Bilga, the Mishmeret, the group of Kohanim who had that particular watch, who are under the family name of Bilga. And the Mishnah told us that Bilga was penalized. That is, that the group of Kohanim as a unit were penalized. For example, the ring that they would normally use for holding an animal's head down in order to do shechita, that was locked into place so they couldn't make use of it. One of their cupboards was not allowed for use. And when they ate their lechem haponim, the shewbread, their portion, they ate at the lower end of the Azara, not the upper end of the Azara. In other words, they were sort of relegated to a lower status as a group. They continued to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, but with obvious and patently obvious differences between their status and the other 23 Mishmoret, because there were 24 in total. And the Gemara brought the reason for it from a brisa, that it was all because one of the family members, Miriam Bas Bilga, Shehi Miridata, that she became an apostate. She turned away from Judaism, and far worse than that, she went and married an officer of the Greeks. And it was amongst the Greeks at the beginning of a Hashmonaim story who entered into the Beis HaMikdash and scoffed at the Beis HaMikdash. She came in with her husband, and she bashed at the Mizbeach with her shoe, with her sandal, and shouted out. And she said, "Lucas, Lucas, wolf, wolf," so to speak, referring to the Mizbeach as a wolf that consumes the sacrifices of the Jewish people, as if it were a live wolf tearing away at its prey, but not offering any benefit to the Jewish people in its place, because here we are, the Greeks, entering into the holy Beis HaMikdash, and where is the Mizbeach defending the Jewish people against these invaders? It isn't doing its job, is it? So it seemed that she was scoffing and taunting the Beis HaMikdash for not doing its job, not defending its people, wasting the Jewish people's money. And as a result, the management of the Beis HaMikdash later on, when they took control again, when the Chazanians went in and cleared up, so to speak, they penalized the whole group of Bilga for the actions of this woman. The Gemara asked, how can that be? Surely we have one woman going off the derech. Why should her family and indeed all the larger group of Bilga be penalized as a result of this one person? We don't normally punish person A for the sins of person B. And the Gemara answered in various ways. First answer it gave was that Miriam wouldn't be saying these things. She wouldn't have gone off this direction if she hadn't heard, shall we say at home, some cynical comments from the Kohanic family itself, in which maybe they talked lightly or impolitely about the Mizbeach, and that eventually gave rise to the attitude of Bilga. In other words, it has to start somewhere. And there was obviously some rot in the family, and therefore the whole family are penalized. The Gemara went on to ask, well, okay, that might explain why her home family are penalized, but why should we penalize the whole group of Bilgar, many of whom probably hardly knew Miriam. Why are they all penalized? Why is this whole team that comes from wherever they come from, and the larger family of Bilga, which may have numbered scores or even hundreds of people, why are they all tainted by this woman, Miriam? And the Gemara's ultimate answer, which is one that's used in other places as well, was Oili Rasha Ole Shchena. Woe is it to an evil person, woe is it to the neighbors of an evil person. In other words, it's not just a person and his immediate family that get caught up in a problem or caught up in a misdemeanor or in a corrupt manner, but anyone who even borders onto them physically or emotionally is likely to get trapped as well. So essentially, even if the other members of Bilga are not involved, the very fact that they all stay together as a group and they live together as a group means that they will inevitably be tainted. If you pepper the scene with bullets, you're going to hit some innocent people as well. And the best advice, and we see this empirically obvious, is that a person should steer clear of bad neighbors, not necessarily even because he himself will be affected by them and by their attitudes, but simply he or she might become collateral damage, which is something we simply can't prevent. And so the whole household and the whole greater family of Bilga essentially get punished as a unit because of Bilga. I also introduced you to the view of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. We had a short video clip of him as well, in which he tries to look at this whole story somewhat differently and claims that maybe Miriam Bas Bilga was almost like a Balat Tshuva when she struck at the Mizbeach and said, "What are you doing to protect the Jewish people?" Maybe she wasn't taunting them. Maybe she was actually almost crying out in pain. Ultimately, she saw where she was, what was being done with the Beis HaMikdash by her family, her new family, her Greek family, and she was almost begging then for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to intercede. At the last moment, she had pangs of conscience, and she wanted this to come to an end. And she was crying in pain that the Mizbeach, so to speak, that Hashem wasn't protecting the Jewish people. And he also went on to talk about Ole Rasha Role Shcheno, to say that there is this question about being the neighbor of a bad person. But sometimes it works. If you're the neighbor of a bad person, you may be able to positively influence them. But the Rebbe says that requires the neighbor to be more proactive than his bad partner on the other side of the wall. Whichever partner is active is going to have more influence on the other. The passive partner will be influenced by the active partner. So if you're a Chabad Chosid, you're not going to be passive. And so your neighbor next door, who might be a threat to you, will end up, or may well end up, being influenced by you. But if you're a passive, then your neighbor who will impart a bad influence on you, and you are under threat. So that was the philosophy of Chabad, and that brought really the Masechta to an end, other than perhaps one line which we could look at. But I'm not going to do that now. I'm actually going to start Masechet Yuma. Now this is a bit out of order in some way, because Sukkah deals with Sukkot and Yuma deals with Yom Kippur. So we should have really dealt with Yom Kippur before dealing with Sukkot. Chronologically, that would have been sensible, but we never thought about it. And so here we are now. And anyway, even after Sukkot, Yom Kippur comes around again the next year. So we're in a position to tackle Yuma as well. The Masechta of Yoma is a bit longer, and parts of it are even more complex. Actually, it's not that long. It is longer, but it's parts of it are related to the Korbanot of Yom Kippur, but there are also other parts which are more general, related to the idea of Tanit in general, the fast of Yom Kippur, and also some of the interesting side stories that the Gemara brings in the build-up to the halachot of Yom Kippurim and the avoda of the Kohen Gadol, as we will see as we enter into the Masechta. It's called Yuma, and Yuma means the day. It's the Aramaic for Hayom, the day. In the Torah, Parshat Achrei Mos is substantially devoted to the avoda of Yom Kippurim, which is a very complex one, involving the Beis Hamikdash, all the technicalities of the order of the day, the order of service of the day, and as well as the fasting. And the Torah there brings a pasuk, says, Ki vayom hazeh yechaper aleichem al chatoseichem. On this day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will atone for you for your sins. Yechaper aleichem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will atone for you. Perhaps it means give you atonement, might be a better, give you a kapora would be a better translation. And it says by Yom Hazeh, on this day. So it's known as, this is this day of Yuma, Hayom. This is the day. It's the day of the year, which is, you might say, almost the most significant day of the year, which is why the Masechta is called Yuma. So that's how we open with the name of the Masechta. The first Mishnah doesn't use the word Yuma, so the name is something which is separate from the first. Sometimes the Masechta actually follows the very first words of the first Mishnah, but the theme is here, the theme of Yom Kippurim. So let's start this Mishnah, which is obviously on Beis Amud Aleph 2a, and I hope that you have the a sheet or a Gemara in front of you. The first Mishnah doesn't deal with Yom Kippur itself and the service of the Kohen Gadol, but rather the preparatory processes for getting the Kohen Gadol in a state where he is able to perform the avoda. There's certain preconditions that are needed before the Kohen Gadol is allowed to perform his service on Yom Kippur. It's a very special day. And what are those preconditions? So the Mishnah opens up by saying, Shivas Yomim Kodem Yom HaKippurim Mafrishin Kohen HaGadol Mibeso. 7 days before Yom Kippur, they separate, they distance the Kohen Gadol from his home. In other words, he's got to leave home. He's going to be essentially in confinement, if you might say, not necessarily in solitary confinement. He won't be in solitary confinement, but he'll be in confinement, and he will be on the premises of the Beis Hamikdash, so that he isn't able to have relationships with his wife, and he's also able to be maintained in a state of purity, of tahara, that he will need for the Yom Kippur service. Essentially, we are preparing him for the big day. And the Mishnah and the Gemara will go on to give us a description of what we're preparing him for. But that's the first thing. He's taken away from his house. I mean, he knows about it. Obviously, this is not a shock to him. He will be asked to leave his house 7 days early for this preparatory purpose. Lelishkas Parhedrin, to the chamber which is known as the Parhedrin. That's where he was, if you like, locked up, you might say, during the 7-day period. I'll just share my screen with you. Second. Okay, I'll magnify that a little bit over here. Let's bring this down. Well, you've seen this picture a few times from me with various color schemes and whatever. Here we have a helicopter view from the top of the Heichal, the great building of the sanctuary, the Beis Hamikdash itself, the building. Here is the Kodesh, and over here you'd have the menorah and the little Mizbeach, and over here that's the Kodesh Kadoshim, the innermost sanctum where the Aron was. And there are chambers around over here. That's what these square marks are doing over here. This part over here is the entrance chamber. It's just an ulam, and here's some steps going in to this magnificent building, which is what used to be Herod's temple, you know, when it was in its greatest magnificence. Over here you have the Mizbeach, the outside Mizbeach in the courtyard. All this is the Azara, the courtyard. And this is the ramp that goes up to the Mizbeach, right next to the steps leading into the Heichal, into the sanctuary building itself. Okay, now you have a few numbers over here. Not all of them are designated as in terms of we haven't got a key for them over here. But in terms of where we think it was, this number 5, this little chamber looks like almost, it could be like a little hut. Number 5, it would have been known as the Lishkat Parhedrin. this little chamber. So the Kohen Gadol would have had to come in. If he was coming in from this direction, he'd have gone up these 15 steps, the Shir Amano steps, from the Ezras Noshim, where all the, remember, the Simchas Beis HaShoeva ceremonies used to take place. There's a real follow-on in this Masechta, interestingly enough, from what we've been learning in Sukkah. At the end of Sukkah, I showed you this diagram. Jaime Sanders. Jaime, I'm giving a share at the moment. Okay. Jaime's using a guest over here, but somehow he couldn't get in. Okay, he would have gone up these stairs, and then he would have entered into this Azor and turned right, and he would have been detained in this chamber number 5 for 7 days. It doesn't look as though it's a very attractive place to be detained. It was probably not very large, but that's where he would be for the 7-day period. So who would be a Kohen Gadol? Not a particularly nice place. There are places to wash, etc., in this whole area. He's not going to be kept grubby, and he would be given food, etc., but he would be isolated over here. Just out of interest, it's thought that this number 6, which is a slightly larger chamber, I mean, all this is not as small as it looks. This is quite a big area, was meant to be the Lishkas Hagozis, the hewn stone chamber, which is where the Sanhedrin would sit. So the Sanhedrin, the main based in for Klal Yisrael, the, if you like, the Bagat, the Havdil of the day, would be in this Lishkas Hagozis and would sit over here. And you can see that there are a number of, if you like, some of this is the office management of the whole of the Jewish people to some extent. And the Kohen Gadol would be in this number 1, this number 5 over here. Let me just quit sharing for a moment. So he would be taken to the Lishkas Parhedrin. What does Parhedrin mean? It comes from the Greek, and it means something like officers of the king. I don't know why exactly. Remember Sanhedrin, Parhedrin. These are chambers in which officials used to be. The official of the court, the judges themselves were the Sanhedrin, and the Parhedrin were officials. So Lishkas Parhedrin would be the officials' chamber, and this is where he was detained for that period. Umaskinin, we go on in the Mishnah, Umaskinin lo. Now, this is an interesting expression. They prepared for him. That's how you would explain Umaskinin lo. They prepared for him Kohen Acher, another Kohen. What does that mean? Tachtov, who would serve in his place. Shema Yera bo psul. If some psul, if some invalidation would occur to the Kohen Gadol, the main Kohen Gadol, there would be a deputy replacement for him in place. Just as you might have in great theatrical parts. What happens if the main singer is out of action? There's an understudy, and the understudy has to be ready to come on board very quickly. So there was an understudy Kohen who also was educated in the avodah of Yom Kippur, which was quite technically and physically trying. And he was there just in case the main Kohen would become Tomei, the Kohen Gadol, in some way due to some accident, and or even become ill. And then this understudy Kohen would become the Kohen Gadol for the purposes of Yom Kippurim in his place. So this was a just-in-case understudy situation. Interestingly enough, Rabbi Yehuda, we'll see, we go on in the Mishnah, takes it even further. And he says more than an understudy was required. We needed to have an underwife as well, as we'll see how this works. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af Isha Acheres Maskinin lo. They even prepared for him another wife. Why? Shema Tomos Ishto. In case his natural wife, his real wife, were to die before Yom Kippurim, and he would thereby become single. And what's wrong with that? Because of the Pasuk. The Pasuk says in Achrei Mos, where it describes the kapora, the atonement rituals that the Kohen Gadol needs to carry out. It says, Shenerma in the verse, V'chiper ba'ado uva'ad beiso, that first the Kohen Gadol actually has to work in an outward spiral, really. He has to start with atoning for himself. Ba'ado. And then uva'ad beso. Then he has to atone for his household, for any things that they may have done wrong, if you like. He has to feel for what he and his family may have perpetrated. And Ba'ad Beiso, says the Mishnah here, famous drasha, Beiso zu ishto. Beiso means not just, it doesn't mean the bricks and mortar of his house, doesn't even mean just his children, but it means mainly, it means his wife. He performs a kapara for himself, a kapara for his wife, and then Ba'ad Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael are last. If he can't atone for himself, he doesn't even get as far, so to speak, as being eligible to atone for the rest of the people. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, or whatever they used to say. First, deal with yourself before dealing with others. So his wife, he has to atone for her as well. So the Posuk seems to take for granted that the Kohen Gadol has a wife to atone for. And therefore, we have a real risk as well. You know, here we are worried that the Kohen Gadol may become Tomei. So we prepare an understudy for him just in case to take over. What happens if, unfortunately, Lo Aleinu, his wife passes away just Erev Yom Kippur, and he's now single? Well, according to this posuk, he's now invalid as far as commencing all the Yom Kippur service is concerned, because he's single. So who's going to do the Yom Kippur service? And he's almost at the last moment left the Jewish people with no kapara. So therefore, he says that they prepare another wife for him, right? An understudy wife. Now, what does that mean? We'll have to see that in a moment, to prepare a wife for him. She sits or stands in the wings, ready to run on, if necessary, and embrace him. What does that actually mean? But so far, this is what Rabbi Yehuda says, that they prepare another wife for him, so he will at least be married through to the second wife, even if his first wife has passed away. So Amru Lo, now, this was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that they prepare a second wife for him. He agrees they prepare a second Kohen, but he says they also prepare a second wife. But the Chachamim, the sages, do not agree that they should prepare a second wife for him. He's a minority on suggesting that a second wife is needed as well. Why? Because Amru Lo, they said to him, Im Kain ein la dova sof. If you want to be as concerned about every minute probability, then ein la dova sof, there's no end to this. What happens if the replacement wife dies? You need to have a second replacement. How many replacements are you going to put along the line to cover all the minute possibilities? So, and this is actually not a very good argument, the Chachamim are saying to Rabbi Yehuda. So they're essentially saying, we throw up our arms, since it would be ridiculous to just have one more wife, because maybe you should have two, maybe you should have three, maybe you should have four. So therefore, they say to him, he doesn't need any other wife other than his own wife. This is not a logical. Why not just give him one other wife? At least it reduces the probability of a real problem. But they say no. Only Rabbi Yehuda is left in the Mishnah saying that they need to prepare another wife for him. According to the Chachamim, it ain't worth it, because maybe then you should say we should have two, maybe three, maybe two will die, and then you need a third wife, maybe three will die, maybe a fourth wife. So we don't bother. So Tosfos already raises the question, why should we be dealing with the Tumah and Tara risk and placing an understudy Kohen there and say that is worthwhile? But according to the Chachamim, they don't say it's worthwhile having a second wife. They agree, the Chachamim, that you have a second Kohen. Why don't you just say that's also ridiculous? What happens if the second Kohen gets Tomei? Let's have a third understudy Kohen, a fourth understudy Kohen. Let's take it all forever. Or let's not have no understudies. Let's have no understudies for any case, either for the Kohen or as another wife. Why are the Chachamim saying, as far as the aspect of him becoming Tomei is concerned, yes, we need an understudy Kohen, but as far as the risk of his current wife dying, we don't need a second wife. That's not symmetrical. So Tosfos suggests that the Gemara will say later on as well, that the risk, Tumah shriach and Misa lo shriach, it's a very strange statement because it depends upon ages and state of health, that Tumah, the possibility of a Kohen becoming Tomei due to some unpredictable event, is something which it has some level of likelihood, whereas the likelihood of his wife passing away just between now, in the week between him being put aside in the Lishkas Parhedrin and Erev Yom Kippur, certainly in a way that he can't even remarry again, is very, very low probability. And therefore, we don't need to worry about, we only need to worry about things that can happen with a significant chance of them happening, but not with an insignificant chance. And in the old days, you know, if a Cohen could become Tommy for a number of different reasons, we're not talking necessarily about Tommy Mace, that he comes into contact with a body. It could be a sheretz, it could be some carcass or something. A rat may come into the Lishkas Parhedrin and suddenly drop dead on him. In theory, he becomes Tommy. You know, it's not something you can really avoid. So since it's more likely to happen than his wife keeling over, therefore everyone agrees he needs to have an understudy Cohen to take over his role, but he does not need to have an understudy wife. However, Rabbi Yehuda says yes. Rabbi Yehuda says he does need an understudy wife. Why would Rabbi Yehuda say that? Well, it seems Rabbi Yehuda is very concerned against even fairly minute possibilities. And after all, think about what's at stake over here. We're talking here about the Kohen Gadol, who's supposed to provide a kapara for the whole Jewish people on this one holiest day of the year. So why take any chances? Why say, well, if it's less than a 1% probability, I'll ignore it? It's not like how you put, E numbers on, on packets. If it's less than 5%, you ignore it. We're talking here about the life and death and welfare for the next year of the Jewish people. So Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, you do prepare another wife. I don't care if it's unlikely. I want to be ready for the most unlikely scenario as well. So that is Rabbi Yehuda. Interestingly enough, the Gemara later on has an almost...
Eli,
Yes.
Eli, presumably the reserve Cohen is married, so that why don't they use him if
because as it seems that we wouldn't do that. Once you have a designated Kohen Gadol, we would not use a reserve Kohen just because the Kohen Gadol's wife has died. But it's a very good question. You're quite right. Why not? Okay, let's leave that open. It seems that if the Kohen Gadol himself is fit, he's not Tommy, then we have to use that Kohen Gadol, and we wouldn't necessarily then use the reserve Kohen Gadol. We rather want to use the Kohen Gadol because his problem is simply that he doesn't have a wife, not that he himself is physically Tommy. Okay, it's a good question. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Stuart? Could it not be as a matter of sensitivity to the position of the spare wife? One has to think of her position, and it's really it's not a very.
Oh, I thought you were worried about the first wife, that all of a sudden the Kohen Gadol is marrying a second wife.
If she dies or something, but the second one is
okay. Okay. So first thing, no one's forcing anyone to become a second wife. We're not actually going to bring her in like Esther from a beauty parade. Somehow, somewhere, another woman is very happy to be potentially married to Kohen Gadol for 24 hours or whatever the case may be. But let's just talk about that a little bit further, because the Gemara later asks some questions. What do we mean? And this affects the question you asked, George. What do we mean when we say maskinin isha acheres, that we prepare another wife for him? So the Gemara says, if it just means he doesn't actually marry her, until the very, very, very last instant that he really needs to. Is that what it means? Well, what happens if the wife suddenly dies and he's not yet, he's in the middle of the Yom Kippur service? The Gemara will ask this in so many months' time, if you like, for us in terms of our learning. Surely just to say maskinim, that we have one in the wings, isn't good enough, because she might suddenly die and he's in the middle of the avodah, and all of a sudden he's not invalid to continue. Now, how is he going to suddenly get back and get married? Ridiculous. So therefore, the Gemara says, yes, you're right. Does not mean we just have one waiting in the wings and a best man with a ring to suddenly put it onto the wife's finger. That's not what it means. He actually does get married to the second wife before Yom Kippur. So he's then simultaneously married to two women, which is allowed to be under the halachas, even though it's not common. But in this situation, he'd be allowed to be married. He gives her kedushin. So the Gemara then asks another. I just give you an idea of the curiosity chain of questions the Gemara brings on to this case of what do you mean you arrange another wife? What does it really mean? Does that mean that they've essentially had nisuin or just kiddushin? You remember that in real marriage, not so much what we do today, but originally marriage was in 2 stages, and they were separated by up to a year. The first stage was kiddushin. He gives her a ring. He says, "Hariyat mikudeshes li b'tabasu," etc., etc. They are now officially, formally married. If any of them strays, it's a matter of adultery. So but she doesn't move into her husband's house, and there's no chuppah. She stays in her father's house for the next year, and she buys a wardrobe, and she gets ready, and she gets color lessons, all of which is far more sensible than what we do today. But after all, who wants to make 2 different chasnas? Then the second chasna, which is the main chasna, happens, which is the chuppah and the nisuin. That's called the nisuin. That's the main marriage, really. She then moves into his house. They go under a chuppah. There are sheva brachas, etc., and everything's nicely done. And then they live together. 2 stages. So the Gemara first wanted to say that he doesn't actually do nisuin. They don't go through any chuppah. What do you need to go through a chuppah for? You can go through the kiddushin and the chuppah consecutively as we do today, even though at the time of the Gemara they didn't used to do that, but you can. But he doesn't need to do that. He just does the ring bit. He just says to her, "Hariyat kobeshes li," etc., etc. They are now officially married. That's good enough for him to then be able to say he's married to 2 women, and if his main wife dies, then that's fine. He's married to another woman. But says the Gemara, that's not right. Can't be. Because if he hasn't gone in through the second stage of marriage, which is an nisuin, then it doesn't fit with the words of the posuk. What did the posuk say? V'chiper ba'ado uva'ad beiso. He shall atone for himself and for his wife, with the word beiso, his house. You can only refer to a married woman as your wife if she's already living in your house. Yes, you can't say this is some kind of formal ceremony in a registrar office somewhere. She would not be called Beso, or even if it was in the Lishkas Parhedrin, this would not be called Beso. So therefore, it must mean that she's properly married to him. And the Gemara says yes. The Gemara is taken step by step to describe what it means. Yes, we accept that. It means that she's not only married Kiddushin, she's married Nisuin. Did they have actual marital relations? The Gemara even goes to talk about whether they need to have marital relations. But let's just leave that for a side. I mean, they've gone through the chuppah and they've had a meal together in the yichud room or whatever you want to call it. Everything's nice. Then the Gemara comes up with a bombshell later on. And it asks another question. It says, but this doesn't make sense either. Because now that she is married, he is married to both his existing wife and to the second wife. And the second wife may be very happy for this. No one says that she's being humiliated. He's married to 2 women. And the Gemara suggests that that itself is also not a fulfillment of this verse. It says, V'chiper ba'dovad beiso. Now, you may not take this too seriously, but the Gemara does. This suggests, says the Gemara, that he's only married to 1 woman. Yeah, it doesn't say to his houses. It says to his house. We're talking about a man who only has 1 wife. And now we've got another problem. You've married this guy, so he's now married. You've married the Kohen Gadol to this second woman. He's married to 2 women. He's also disqualified for the service. Maybe they both will survive all the way through, and he's married to 2 women, and the Torah says he can only be the Kohen Gadol if he's only married to 1 woman. So you're in a real quandary. How are we going to apply Rabbi Yehuda's rule? So after the end of a very, very long argument, and I won't go all the way through to this, we'll do it when we do it in the Gemara. The Gemara has to come up with an extraordinarily complicated system so that he's only married to 1 woman at the time that he does the avoda, and it's done by giving both women, and I won't go through the procedures, it's an absolute masterpiece, a conditional get. And the conditional get has such conditions in that it's only going to divorce one of the women in the situation where both are alive, but it won't divorce the women if one of them is needed, the one that is needed to survive, if you like. Both of them get a different terms in terms of conditional get. And if you all work it together, and we'll have to go through this, you'll see by magic, everything's being taken care of. through this complicated conditional get. You can give a conditional get. The Gemara Gittin is full of conditional gittin, where a person says, I only want my get to take effect if X, Y, and Z. And you can say, I want the get to take effect from now if X and Y and Z does happen in the future or doesn't happen in the future. And now these are time machine events where you have to start thinking what it really means. Am I divorced? Am I not divorced? Will that take effect? Has it taken effect, etc.? But by applying conditional gittin to both of these women, you can wangle it that he's only going to be married to one at the time of the avoda. And that's how the Gemara ultimately learns this halacha of Rabbi Yehuda. But don't forget, this is only Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe this is the reason, ultimately, that the Chachamim have given up on this idea of giving him more than one wife. Remember, it's only Rabbi Yehuda says he should have another wife. Because if the way you have to solve it is by giving up all sorts of cleverly worded, multiple conditioned gittin, different ones phrased for each wife, in a sense, it isn't even worth it. It looks very, very artificial. Yeah. So they say one wife is enough. And what we do is we all have to daven that the wife that he has at the time of the avoda is still alive. Maybe if she isn't, Stuart, maybe if she isn't, then we will, according to the Chachamim, say you don't prepare a second wife. Maybe it's a second Cohen who will take over, who presumably has a wife, unless her wife has died as well. This is all very interesting Gemara, isn't it, really? But these are what you have to go through, says the Gemara, in order to fulfill the role of being Kohen Gadol. Okay, that was the end of the Mishnah. We had this disagreement to Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim on the question of whether another wife is needed for the Kohen Gadol. There was agreement that a second Kohen is needed, just in case the Kohen Gadol becomes possible. And the Mishnah started off telling you there was a 7-day period of preparation to try and minimize the chances of any problems with the Kohen Gadol himself. And the Gemara is later on going to say that during this period, the Kohen Gadol is prepped, he is prepared for his day in the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Kippur. He's got to be super fit. He probably has to do all sorts of weightlifting exercises, etc., because he does everything himself. All sorts of korbanos. He goes from place to place, up and down. He has 5 different changes of clothing. He has to go into the mikveh many times, etc., etc. And he has to be able to do all this almost without hesitation, and everything has to work first time. So this is also a period where he's brought up to skill, if you like, for the great day. Let's start the Gemara now. The Gemara says, Tanan Hossam, we learned in a Mishnah. Now, this is going to bring a parallel to our case of our Mishnah here, 7-day preparation for the Kohen Gadol prior to Yom Kippurim. There's another very similar halacha, and this is what the Mishnah is going to bring in, which is close very much to the requirements over here. Shivas Yomim, Kodem Sreifas HaPorah, 7 days before the Porah Aduma animal is burnt to ashes. Hoyu Mafrishin Kohen HaSoref, they would separate the Kohen who is going to perform the burning of the ceremony. This took place on Har HaZeisim. This is something very different to many of the other Kochim-related rituals. The preparation of the Porah Aduma was a whole topic in itself. They separated that Kohen. Actually, we'll see from the Chumash, it doesn't have to be the Kohen Gadol. It could also be the Skan Kohen Gadol. It could be another Kohen. That's why the Mishnah here doesn't say Hoyu Mafrishin Kohen Gadol, Hoyu Mafrishin Kohen HaSoref. That Kohen who is tasked with preparing the ashes of the Porah Aduma is separated mi beso, from his house, almost the same words as our Mishnah, but on a different halacha, lelishcha al panei habira, to a lishka, to a chamber. Again, he's confined to a chamber for the 7 days prior to his ritual. Al panei habira, the Gemara is going to ask, what does this mean? Which really means, which is in the front of the Beis HaMikdash, Tzofona Mizracha, northeast. The Lishkas Beis HaEvan Hoysa Nikres. And this Lishka, this chamber was called the Lishka, the chamber of the stone house. It's not entirely clear. We'll see even later on. There's a machlokus. Was this chamber actually near the chamber, for example, of Parhedrin in the Beis Hamikdash, or was it actually outside the Beis Hamikdash but on the Har Habayis? There's a machlokus. So I'm not going to show a position for this because the position really isn't known. However, let me just get back to basics over here. The preparation of a paraduma was only done very, very exceptionally after a very, very long interval of time. The paraduma ashes were dissolved in water when you have plenty of this. A big stock of it was available in the Beis Hamikdash. Someone who was Tomei Mace needed to go through a purification ritual in which a Kohen would sprinkle the waters and dust of the paraduma on the person who needs to become pure of his contact with a dead body. And there, you only needed a very, very small drop of sprinkling on every Tomei Mace, which means that if you have prepared a paraduma, you've gone through the ritual, some of which we'll describe over here, and you've burnt the para, and you've dissolved it into water, you can make sufficient, if you like, sprinkling stock of paraduma product to last for 100 years, maybe, for a very, very long time. So the Mishnah over here concerns itself with when a Kohen exceptionally has to go through the process of making a new paraduma, not the sprinkling, which happens every day in the Beis Hamikdash, but rather the preparation. And it says that everything has to be done in purity, and they separated this Kohen who was going to do it for 7 days, the parallel of the 7 days before Yom Kippur that we've just been reading in our own Mishnah. And he was taken to this place, Al Pnei HaBirot, Safona Mizracha, on the northeast of the Beis Hamikdash, where he was kept. Then all the materials necessary for preparing the paraduma were taken out on a bridge which had no contact with the ground so that it wouldn't become tomei by young children or whatever. They said the waters were taken from the stream by young children who'd never become tomei, and the materials were taken out of the Beis Hamikdash to the Har HaZeisim. So they had to get to Har HaZeisim in complete tahara, and it was there that the Kohen Gadol would do the burning, the shechting, the burning, and the mixing, and then he would take all this new prepared para aduma stock down into the Beis Hamikdash. It would be taken down to Beis Hamikdash. But the preparation actually took place on the Har HaZeisim. This is very exceptional because nearly everything else which was in any way sacred was done in the Beis Hamikdash. And over here, the Torah says that he should be looking towards the Beis Hamikdash from the hill, Har HaZeisim, looking down on the view below, but he should be up on the hill when he makes this preparation. All the sprinklings took place, of course, in the Beis Hamikdash. It's just this unique occasion preparation that needed to be done up there on the hill. Okay, and the Gemara asked the question over here, noting this parallel, the Loma Nikra Shema Lishkas Beis HaEven. By the way, why was this chamber called the Beis HaEven that they separated him into? What was the function of this chamber, apart from the fact we'll see that some of these chambers in the Beis Hamikdash were multifunctional. It wasn't just a place. The Lishkas Parhedrin wasn't just a place the Kohen Gadol went into for 7 days. Other things were there done as well. You can imagine it's a sort of multifunction office. And the Lishkas Beis HaEven had other functions than simply a place where the Kohen who was going to burn the paraduma would be seated and sleep for the 7 days prior to his ceremony. But why was it therefore called Beis HaEven? What's special about the stone? Shekol ma'aseha, because there, it seems, all the tools for the paraduma were kept, all the preparatory kalim, the vessels, and all those kalim for the paraduma were made kol ma'aseha bichli galolim, bichli avonim, or bichli adoma. They used well, there are 3 types of materials. We'll see why in a moment. Umay tama, why were the materials from which all the kalim for paraduma were constructed made out of these 3 materials? My tama, kiven de tvul yom kosher vapora. because a Tavul Yom is kosher b'para. Now, this is going to lead us into a devious little argument we'll see in a moment. However, Kli Even, Kli Galolim, and Kli Adama, what are they? Kli Galolim, you know what Galolim is? It's dung. I know we don't think much about making your kitchen equipment out of dung, but dung is very good. If you pat it together and you dry it, etc., you can make kalim out of it. And we'll see what the advantage is in a moment. Also, Kli Avonim, you can make kalim, you can make vessels, receptacles out of stone as well. Or Kli Adama, out of earthenware. All these three types of material have a property that they are not mekabel tumah. They do not become tomei by contact. Now, other things, very many other things, particularly metal and glass and other things, can become tomei, which means that if, shall we say, something which is tomei makes contact with the side of the vessel, then even a scrape by the side of the vessel makes the vessel tomei, which can contaminate with tuma anything in the vessel. Now, that's very inconvenient in the Beis HaMikdash, and particularly for Paraduma, where you want to be very, very careful, because all of a sudden, what you prepared is suddenly not fit for use. So, however, there are rules, and the rules are that Galolim, Avonim, and Adama are not Mekabel Tuma. So unless, essentially, a sheretz or something was actually to fall into the contents, if you then plug those vessels, any contact on the side isn't going to make those vessels tomei. It's just like the idea of a conductor of electricity and an insulator of electricity. You know, one will conduct electricity and one insulates. In the same way, these materials are insulators to tumah, and therefore, very much, it was very much the style in Beis HaMikdash to make as many things out of stone and out of clay, out of dung. I mean, not necessarily things you're going to drink, but stuff which you may need to store things in as you could, because that would guarantee that they would remain tahor for indefinitely. And this was the reason. And this particular chamber was where most of the stone kalim were kept. If you go into the burnt house, you've been there in the Rova, just before you go down the stairs to the kotel on the left, Habayit Hasaruf. If anyone hasn't been there, you really should go there. It's actually one of the gems of the whole area of the Rova and the kotel area. And a lot of people don't go there, and they miss out so much, because you get to understand the history of the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash, because it was originally a house, I think, where the Castros family, one of the Kohanic family, lived, and you will see that most things in there they found were made of stone. And the reason is because they wanted to make sure that their food kalim didn't become tomei. You know, they would keep their truma, etc. in there. And if you go there, you get a video, and you get to see some of those things as well. So stone was the most available and probably the cleanest compared to dung, maybe, and earthenware, which is messy as well. So they would use stone. Okay, now the Mishnah went on to say, why did they use all these very, very insulating vessels for the paraduma? But the Gemara here gives an astonishing answer. It doesn't just say because we want to be careful, but it says given to full yom kosher b'para, and then it goes on to tell you something very, very interesting. It will bring in the machlokas between the tzedukim and the perushim, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees actually had a kula. They were very lenient. In many ways, the Pharisees were much more lenient than the Sadducees, because if you take the Torah literally, as you know, on many cases, there's almost nothing you can do. You wouldn't be able to have cholent on Shabbos. You'd have to have your lights off, right? You'd have to have only cold food, all sorts of things you'd have to do. And you wouldn't have any of the interpretations of Torah Shabbal Peh. And the interpretations of Torah Shabbal Peh, they may include other elements which are not in the Torah, but generally the interpretations are lenient in comparison to the simple translations. In other words, Chazal have a tradition that the Torah means something other than its stark meaning. Now, you'd think you need someone who is tahor, pure, to gather the ashes of the parahaduma and be involved. And indeed, the Pasuk says, "V'osaf for ish hatahor," the pure man shall gather. So that Tzedukim had a tradition, and they also They also used or wanted to use the Parah Adumah because it's in the Torah. They have no problems with what's in the Torah. They know that Tumas Mace needs to be removed and purified by the water and ashes of the Torah of the Parah Adumah. But they read this posuk as disqualifying anyone, any Kohen, who was other than in the utmost state of purity from preparing the Parah Adumah. Whereas the sages, the Perushim, did not. They didn't interpret the posuk in quite the same way. So to understand how the difference is expressed here, we need to also distinguish between two stages in the purification of a person who's become Tomei. Let's not take the example of someone who's Tomei Mace. That's the most serious case and works differently. Let's say someone who touched a sheretz of some sort. Now, really, their normal purification ritual is really quite simple. There's no Parah Adumah needed for that. You had to go to the mikveh, and when you go to the mikveh, after you come out of the mikveh, then you're already stage 1 tahar. Interesting idea. It's a bit like Kiddushin in Isuin I mentioned before. You're stage 1 tahar when you come out of the mikveh as a Kohen, which means that you can touch and do certain things you couldn't do while you were still Tomei. But there are certain things like eating kodshim, which a Kohen normally does, holy meats from the Beis HaMikdash, which he still cannot do until the evening is up, until the sun goes down. It's called Erev Shemesh. And only when the evening's up is he stage 2 or 2 pure. He's stage 1 pure when he comes out of the mikveh, allows him to do certain things, but still disqualifies him from doing other things. He's stage 2 pure when the sun goes up. It's from Psukim in the Torah. Chazal said, when they understood the posuk, that the Kohen who burns the ashes is allowed to do so even if he is only stage 1 pure, only stage 1 tahar. Sounds very surprising. He can't eat kodshim yet, so he's not 100% pure. He can't do everything, but he's already allowed to prepare the ashes of the Parah Adumah. That's the way Chazal understood it. Great leniency, you might think. The Tzedukim were much more Haredi, and they said, no, where are you making this distinction from? This guy, this Kohen after stage 1 is not completely pure. It's only, as the Torah says, when the sun goes down that he's fully pure. So we would say that any Kohen who is not yet reached stage 2, in other words, he's had the Tevilah, his mikveh Tevilah, but he's still waiting for sunset, he is not allowed, that Kohen is invalid for performing the preparation of the Parah Adumah. That was the Tzedukim. Tzedukim said, you have to be stage 2 pure before you can prepare the Parah Adumah, but the Perushim, our lot, said stage 1 pure. You see, it's always better being, people say, oh, I read this the Torah, literally it doesn't say all this, that, and the other. It doesn't say there's a muktzah, it doesn't say all these things, I prefer to go according to the written law. What if they do? If they were at the time of Tzedukim, they would be far more unpleasantly dealt with all across the spectrum of halacha than we are following Torah Shabbal Peh. Okay, so the Tanan, the Gemara goes on to explain itself. What has this got to do with having stone vessels and stuff like that? This comes from a Mishnah in Parah, in Masechet Parah. Listen to this, a very extraordinary fact. Mitamin hayu hakohen hasoref es hapara. The Kohen who was going to perform the Parah Adumah service was asked to make himself deliberately Tomei. This is all going to be a finger in the eyes of the Tzedukim. You can almost guess what's coming up. They metamed him deliberately. You've got a Kohen, he's completely tahar. He's being told that he's going to prepare the Parah Adumah, and they say to him, now we're going to make you Tomei. So it's easy to make a person Tomei. You know, there are certain things you can do very easily. All you need to do probably is just not be very careful for a few hours, go outside for a walk, take a smoke, walk in the street, hold the rest, go to a restaurant, eat at a table, and then touch the Kohen. And there's a suffix already. Somewhere along the line, you probably touched something that was Tomei, and you've been matama to some extent the Kohen. They did this deliberately. Yes, so they manhandled this Cohen with his own with his permission to make him Tomei, umat bilinoso, and then they during the next hour they put him through in the mikveh. He did tefillah, so now he's stage 1 tahor, not stage 2. It's not nighttime yet. And and then they asked him to perform the preparation of a parah aduma while he was stage 1 tumah. Why? Dafka lahotzi milibon shel tzedukim, in order to make it clear that we don't follow the instructions of the Tzedukim. The Tzedukim would have said, you cannot let this man prepare the Parah Aduma. We know what's right. Chazal wanted to assert themselves. They wanted to assert themselves. The Perushim were in charge, and they wanted to make it absolutely clear that they had an interpretation of Torah Shebaal Peh, which is the one that we follow. And according to Torah Shebaal Peh, a person who is stage 1 Torah is also allowed to prepare the paradoma, and we're going to prove it to you by deliberately making a person only stage 1 Torah. And that's what they did. Because the Tzedukim held, Shahayu Omrim, they held, Bim'ur v'Hashemesh Nasis. That the Kohen would only be allowed to perform the Parah Aduma preparation if he had been through stage 2. So they deliberately made a Kohen Tahor, the Perushim, in order to prove their point. And in a number of places we find in Shas, the Gemara says that certain things were done lahotzi milibon shel tzedukim. In other words, you actually engineer a situation in which you carry on a process in such a way which the opposition, Tzedukim, will be up in arms, because you want to make it clear that we interpret the Torah according to Torah Shebaal Peh. And this is the situation over here. So let me just get into the final words over here. What has this got to do then with the stone vessels and doing everything with stone, and so that things wouldn't be Tomei? We said a moment ago, Kli Avonim, Kli Adoma, etc., and Kli Kololim. We're now saying we're not so worried about Tumah. Why, therefore, were they so careful with the vessels? Why? It's a kinila Rabbana. So Rabbanan made a takana, Kli Kololim, Kli Avonim, or Kli Adoma, de lo lekable Tumah, to particularly be very careful with the vessels that are not mekabel any Tumah, ki heichi de lo lizalzlubo, in order that people shouldn't get the wrong idea. Because ironically, in a sense, you think about this, the rabbis were taking a very big risk. What they were doing over here is they were deliberately playing very, very close to the wind in order to prove that Tzedukim were wrong. How much better wouldn't it be? You've got a Kohen who's originally Tahar. Why deliberately put him under some sort of Tumah in order just to show the opposition Dafka? And when you so do, you run a risk. There's a collateral risk. There may be a collateral benefit in that Tzedukim are proved wrong, but there's a collateral risk that people who see that a Kohen who's not stage 2 Tahar is allowed to make a Parah Aduma, what will they say? Well, Parah Aduma is obviously not something we need to be so careful about. Look, I mean, they're even using people only stage 1 Tahar. They're doing this for a reason, but the man in the street doesn't know that this is just down to be dafka to the Tzedukim. What he gets to see is a Kohen who they know is stage 1 Tar only, and is being allowed to do the Parah Aduma ceremony, which suggests that we don't take Parah Aduma seriously in terms of Tumah and Tara. So in order to undo that collateral damage, they said you have to use only the most Tahar instruments and Tahar Kalim, Galolim, Avonim, etc., and Adoma, in order again to move the balance the other way, to show that we are careful with the Parah Aduma. You see how careful we are over here. On the one hand, we're careless, deliberately to show the Tzedukim that they're wrong. On the other hand, we spring back to a middle position straight away, because we don't want the Am Shabasoda, the people in the fields, to suddenly feel that, in fact, we don't have to be careful with Paraduma. Okay. That all this was brought as a tangent on the side to show that there is a parallelism between the preparation of the Paraduma and the Kohen getting ready for Yom Kippurim. There's a 7-day preparation ceremony. And the Gemara is going to ask, where do we know this from later on? We won't do that this week. I mean, we haven't got a source for either of these two. Why 7 days? Why not 3 days? Yeah, it's not as if we're sprinkling any paraduma on the Kohen Gadol. He's not Tommy Mace. There's no 7 days that appears in any obvious halacha as a separation period. And we know there are various nice 7-day periods that appear in halacha in other ways, but not in relation to the Kohen Gadol. And we'll have to wait to see why this 7-day restriction was imposed. Okay, I'm going to stop my recording.